for Space Ranger. High mobility, versatile support that's still very intact. And she brings some utility that is in the support cast that only one character has at the moment. So that's going to be a lot of fun. The game's going to be really fast. It's going to get really fast.
Big news coming to Overwatch 2. Recently I had the opportunity to sit down with Alec Dawson, lead gameplay designer for Overwatch 2, in a rather intimate one-on-one call. Why would I use that term? Discussing balance, hero changes, Season 11, and much, much more. There's a ton to unpack in this interview. I'm going to do my best to simplify each of those points for you, but I highly recommend checking out the interview in full, link in the description, for elaboration on any of these points. I asked him what was his challenges of becoming a game designer, and he talked a lot about developing phrases and sayings, finding consistent themes that the balance team could do over and over, basically developing a balance philosophy in an entirely new game. I talked about how does the communication, when we're dealing with so many of the criticisms that Overwatch 2 developers deal with, how do they respond to that level of criticism, and how do they not let that distract them? Essentially, they focus on just doing what they need to do, trying to make sure that they have good sources of criticism from trusted sources, and then honestly just tuning out the noise as best they can. Funny shout out, he actually says that I do install Twitter from my phone because otherwise it's just too distracting. Season 11, I asked him what he was very excited about. He started off with no glass, man, no glass, Coliseo, right? So removing the glass, obviously something that's definitely on their minds. He also talked about the magnetic grenade, where it felt like there was a more visible punishment and didn't feel quite as random, and having an understandable and natural threat radius with the ability. More instant engagement with the ability, and overall a lot of tweaks that they're very excited to see play out over the course of this coming season. The goals of Season 11 was really about shaking up the top meta. Kiriko, Sojourn, Roadhog, trying to change things from being so top-heavy in terms of the way that Kiriko and Sojourn were meta at the highest ranks. And obviously, Roadhog's domination across the ranks was something they're trying to tweak down as well.
Kiriko and Sojourn have been around and very prominent for a long time. And I think Sojourn, we've kind of actually started to see, like, she's actually hit that power level threshold, or lower than the threshold, where, okay, her popularity is dropping. You know, it is actually dropping at like a rapid rate in terms of where she's going to end up compared to where she's been for basically her entire existence in Overwatch 2. Roadhog is pretty popular. You know, when there are sharper mechanics, I think we don't want to see a certain popularity level. It's you know, we try not to play favorites. We try to be quite impartial, but at the same time, you know, with how survivable he was, and you know, in terms of he has this combo and everything, I think he was seen very popular raids even at the highest levels of play, right? So he wanted to get that a bit more stabilized too.
They felt like some of the characters like Diva, Symmetra, Reaper, Idiari were being a little bit left behind, and they're trying to buff those characters in more skillful ways. Sojourn was taking away the one-shot, giving them the opportunity to tweak more knobs, maybe injecting power into other ways. He mentioned spread being something to tweak so that we can maybe allow her to have this tighter spread if she doesn't always have the threat of essentially what is a one-shot. And they felt like Symmetra was left behind a little bit due to the Season 8 Mauga meta with the Cardiac Overdrive buffing that character. Now, I'm a little bit personally reticent on this one because I think she might be coming right back in because Mauga is still playable, but more about that later. One of the questions that I had was like, how do you determine a map to be problematic? We talked about Coliseo needing a rework. How do you determine a map to be a rework? You can't really do hero rates or pick rates or whatever. Usually he says a lot of it is community feedback and intuition. The game has changed. It's shifted away from choke points. We want to really open up old maps is what he says. He talked about applying some of those concepts in Runesapi, run back times compared to other push maps, opening points near the checkpoint, but having a choke towards the end that doesn't quite feel so open, but not brutally choke like many of the other old maps. Learning lessons to new Flashpoint maps as well, expect shorter run back times. So basically looking for choke solutions and learning from some of the lessons that some of the breakpoints and difficulties that we've had with both Flashpoint and Push already. We talked about one of their hero philosophies for new characters being on the safe side of strong. Do they still feel like that's a good new hero philosophy? And he says that yes. Idiari we released maybe a little bit too strong, but close to where they wanted her. Mauga definitely reacted too quickly to the trial in both directions. I think maybe too quickly buffed and then too quickly nerfed, at least too heavy of a buff and then too heavy of a nerf. And definitely showcases that, you know, quick changes need to be done, but you need to be cautious with how those changes are applied. Venture felt very happy with Venture's release, and moving forward, they're definitely going to continue that slogan of leaving it on the safe side of strong initially to get people playing that character. Maybe reacted a little bit too quickly with the Venture nerf, but people really enjoyed Venture overall. Trials basically allow them to react very quickly, and by trials, he means the early releases the characters have where you're able to try them out for a couple of days. It gives them a little bit of extra information when it comes to balancing and designing the character at the last second. I asked about low utility supports, characters like Mercy, Moira, Lifeweaver, where it feels like much of their identity is either low impact utility or just some significantly higher heal output without a lot of interesting playstyle adjustments. Will they address that in the current? Is that something to keep in mind in the future? I think it's more about like making them not quite as strong in their niches. So finding different, more dynamics with how they play.
I think it's about making some of those heroes what their niche is, just a bit more strong and more unique.
Right.
We're okay with certain heroes not like ever reaching the highest levels of competitive play. I think like Moira in particular, like we're okay with some heroes being a little bit more simple to understand, a little bit more approachable.
Now, I didn't love that answer necessarily, but I understand that as long as we're okay with letting some characters not being basically high level, we don't want Moira metas in the highest level, maybe it's okay. If you guys have seen any of my other videos, we talked about how I feel like a lot of these lower skill characters can hurt lower ranked players, but it was a fair answer, and I think we'll move on to the next one here. Projectile heroes, are they left behind? He gave me a little bit of pushback here. He says that I think Pharah, Venture are quite strong. Yes, there's definitely some characters, projectile characters specifically that have lost their identity. He brought Hanzo.
Hanzo in particular. Hanzo's the one we've been talking about in terms of he's kind of lost his identity within the cast. Yeah. We look at Storm Arrow is the place to look is in terms of bringing back some of the one-shot for certain thresholds. Actually playing with some changes for to bring some characters that are a bit more squirrely to 225 and seeing how that goes. And it does benefit Hanzo at that point. He becomes a character that can actually be very, very effective against some of those characters.
One of my questions was about how it's often human psychology to where we lean into the easy and inactive approach, camping, sniping, anything that doesn't involve me directly interfering or taking a risk. We're often very risk averse in our lives. So do we factor that into balance whatsoever? Alex said that he thought lower skill characters were more consistent, that maybe just don't have quite the same peaks of value that some of the more high skill characters have. We want to introduce risk for some characters like Mauga. We found that Venture in beta design actually had a primary fire that exploded into shrapnel that gave Venture some range that Venture doesn't really have right now. But they found out that Venture was basically in trials, in closed trials, was basically just poking from range without actually engaging until they took that away. You're forced to actually engage, you're forced to take angles with Venture, and ultimately that gameplay loop felt a lot healthier. So he said that they definitely are aware of that tendency, and they do keep that in mind when they're developing new characters. I asked a question about balancing heroes that are universally hated. I basically said that you look at a character like Tracer, people are a little bit tired of Tracer right now. She's been meta for quite some time, but she is a relatively high skill character, and there's a lot of counterplay when it comes to Tracer. And you look at a character like Roadhog, he hasn't been meta for near as long as Tracer, at least recently, but he was universally decried as just being unbelievably unplayable, right?
But someone in the community coined it was called a grievance rate, whereas certain decks are going to have certain grievance rates, and if they're more popular, they can't be popular for so long unless and our job is to come in and kind of make sure some of those frustrations actually go down, right?
Right.
But if you see it once in every X amount of games, it's okay. If you saw Widowmaker every single game, I think that may not be the best for us. But we like Widow in certain maps. We like Widow, like players being able to pull off these really skillful moments, and I think it creates an interesting relationship. But if it was every game, I think we'd have to come in, right?
Overall, we want to pursue variety, but overall, we don't necessarily want the variety to be equally long for all characters. Heroes have a half-life where they can be too strong before we need to take action, and some characters have a shorter half-life than others. I asked him, should characters have strengths and weaknesses? How far do we want to lean into the dynamism, right, where characters can do a little bit of everything? He says we want characters to have strengths and weaknesses, but the question needs to be how extreme should we go with those strengths and weaknesses. Hack should take maybe a little bit longer to hit on a tank so that it gives some counterplay, basically improving counterplay to affect all ranks if possible. I pushed back on that and asked, would giving tanks counterplay mean that you'd have to reduce some HP, maybe to an extent? We want to make them more survival than pre-season 9 changes, but in general, we want characters to have some strengths, some weaknesses, but we want a little bit more counterplay introduced into that, and we want to make sure that the strengths and weaknesses are not too extreme, because otherwise it could be very difficult to play around that character. I asked about the counterability of characters. What are your goals for each role? So Alec says the goals for each role, initially they said they wanted supports to be more scrappy, but they found that they've kind of migrated away from that when it felt like supports were often just duelists like DPS, but better in many ways.
Part of the goal is getting to the support in the backline, right? That should be part of the challenge and the hard part sometimes, right? And we look at things like Zen Kick and how good that was as a get off me as well. So I think there was an extent we just went too far, right? In that way. So I think right now, when we look at some of the future supports, we can claw back a little bit. Our next year is a lot of mobility, but we're making a even down the line support, and we're hey, maybe we don't need like support can have a little bit more lower mobility. Like maybe if they don't need to actually fight back when they're in close range a little bit. But I think we gave a little bit that too much to everyone at a certain point in time.
I asked him what's his most important source from feedback. Where do you get your feedback from making changes, making tweaks? He says definitely a very broad selection, high level feedback, low level feedback, a lot of internal testing. The question needs to be, where's the feedback consistent? And he honestly said that they looked for sources that provide positive feedback for good changes and negative feedback for bad changes. I think he feels that we need to be looking for sources that where we can kind of trust them to give a more objective opinion and not necessarily just farm negativity or just be overly positive without actually looking at something objectively. It's important that when you're being critical of feedback that you're being specific with what you don't like and be specific with what you do like, because that gives them more clear guidance. And that when they're looking for feedback from external sources, that's often what they're looking for. I asked a question about experimentation with their philosophy. How they've been a lot more aggressive with tweaking things, trying new things, being more aggressive, balance changes here, and then scaling them back, especially compared to the Overwatch 1 philosophy, which was basically make minor tweaks every 3 or 4 months. Nothing really changes for long periods of time. Overwatch 2 has been a lot more responsive. He says that's definitely something specific that they're going to be working on. Seasons can be and should be big shakeups. They want to react quicker and pull back faster without going too over the top on negative or positive things. I asked him, how do they test out changes? How do they actually internal test things? He says they want to go in with some overall goals. They need to, what are we looking for? What are some things that we need to be testing? What are specific breakpoints and things, boxes that we want to check with each character? And they definitely have some blind spots here and there. We brought up Lifeweaver as being a potential blind spot in terms of their testing, because obviously Lifeweaver launch was just a big flop in every single way. And so there's definitely some blind spots. He actually brought up an interesting blind spot where Lifeweaver had a lot of issues with controller mapping on console. They just totally missed that kind of stuff. But as they get better with more practice with hero release, they're trying to increase the quality of their internal testing as well. One of the philosophies that they're aware of is just how it can be very difficult, maybe not a philosophy, but just something to be aware of, is that how very difficult it can be to balance around the perception of a character. Metas are not static. It's a very social or even regional thing. For example, Roadhog, very strong character, is just not played in Korea whatsoever. And a lot of times Ana and Winston have a much higher pick rates in those regions, despite not being as picked as much in the West. So it's not just about picking about what's objectively balanced, but the pick rates and the win rates, and people just forcing things in different regions for different reasons. Metas are definitely a psychological thing for each region, and something even that a content creator, a streamer, can influence lower ranks, even if it's not necessarily applicable for them. Whatever people latch onto tends to be exaggerated in the opposite way. So they want to try to make sure that they're aware of that when they're making these balance things, and not just necessarily knee-jerk reactions to what's the general consensus, unless it is objectively true. Ask about role passives. This has definitely been a controversial topic in the community. Tank, DPS, support passive. Should characters have broad free value?
As a tank, you don't necessarily feel every single passive tuning mark.
Right.
You know, you might feel the 30 to 50% of the knockback, but from game to game, you may not feel some of the other ones, right? But it's like, if we give you something actually for your kit, it's going to be much more pronounced. It's going to be something that actually like cuts through. And also, that's actually the thing from what we've seen over time. It's going to make the biggest change to that hero's performance or survivability or whatever it may be, is actually just changing something on the kit itself.
I asked, is this because just having passive value isn't particularly fun? He said, yes. He says it's a lot more exciting to be like, oh, I lived because of passive versus, oh, I used one of my new abilities or a new flavor in my kit to survive or to pop off. I found that one extremely encouraging to hear, so we'll keep an eye on that one moving forward. And this is the 66 question, or as close to it. I asked about the solo tanking experience, the difficulty of basically being the center of attention at all times, and even if you are the most powerful person on the battlefield objectively, subjectively it feels terrible, and you're often the person that's focused down, counter-swapped, and just shot in the face, CC cushion all the time, and then how do you balance that without buffing the role too much? He says next patch they're going to be focusing on that. They want to basically make tank the carry, not the chore. They want to be able to allow tank to be able to create their own playmaking potential without necessarily breaking the role. Overall, tanks, he says, have to dictate the flow of engagement. There's a lot of responsibility. But we want to make sure that the defensive capabilities and the playmaking is more on an individual basis without making them unkillable.
Like Winston, we're looking at how to make the ultimate a little bit better, and how to maybe the right click can be a bit more responsive. Doesn't need to take as long as it does to charge at the moment. Things like that. Okay. We can still working through Reinhardt, but can charge be 300 damage again. I think that's one of the ones we're looking at where it's okay, now it's going to hit most of the characters in the cast.
That's exciting.
Stuff like that.
That's exciting. That's going to get a lot of people, I think, talking. We want to be very careful about, obviously, some personal opinions here about how we buff tank in the 5v5 environment, because the role is already strong. How do you deal with the psychology of that? He says we're going to be dealing on an individual basis, which I think is the correct response. We'll have to wait and see exactly what's done. So one of the things that talked about in Season 11 coming later was pickable passives. It's a quick play hack thing where people are going to be able to select different buffs. So Alex says there's going to be 3 additional passives you're going to be able to select from. More ammo, maybe seeing enemies through walls, basically making a variation of a hero before making a counter swap. It's basically a small look of something bigger that may be coming in the future. It's going to be a pretty big quick play hack tweak here, maybe more so than any of the stuff that we've seen previously, so stay tuned for that one. And I asked him about Mauga. The general perception, at least in the West, is that we always have Roadhog, Orisa, or Mauga at least soft meta. And he says Mauga's about average or below average in terms of performance right now. They'll keep an eye on him. He says that they do better in coordinated environments right now because synchronizing your cardiac drive or overdrive with your team DPS, your teammates, is something that a lot of high-level plays has been revolving around. But they're going to be looking at it in the future. They want to make sure that setting squishies on fire is easier as well. There's a couple of things that they're looking at with Mauga moving forward. General question I had about bugs. There's a lot of people, the Doomfist, Genji, Mercy mains are always in my chat and asking me, like, what about this bug fix or what about that bug fix? Alex says they just want to do a better job of highlighting when bugs are fixed. So, and obviously in terms of those bugs themselves, their quality control team is always working on those things 24/7, he's saying. So we'll just have to keep an eye on this moving forward. And as he said, they want to do a better job of highlighting when those things are actually fixed, so people are like, hey, progress is actually being made. We'll go back to the support hero. Space Ranger, how does Space Ranger feel? And he says high mobility, very versatile support. The utility in the support cast that only one character has is now shared by Space Ranger, and he describes her as very fast. I'll let you draw your own conclusions there. As I said, this is a very, very, very brief rundown of a very extensive, in-depth conversation with Alec. I really appreciate him and the Blizzard team for offering to do this for me. This is not something I begged on my knees for. They offered to do this. Their communication has been exceptional. There's a lot of details in here. Even if you don't necessarily agree with every single point here, I think you'll understand a little bit more of his logic about the way that Blizzard is doing things moving forward. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video.